Crisis Media Center continues. We'll be talking about one very interesting topic. The colleagues from Center UA and other have developed the constructor of association kit. What, who, and when should the government do to successfully implement the economic part of EU-Ukraine Association Agreement? We have Taras Kachka, American Chamber of Commerce Vice President, Robert Zeldi, EI Customs Manager, Dmytro Lutsenko, expert of the EU project on removing technical barriers to trade, and Sergei Sidorenko, head of the Ukrainian EU Pravda, and also Liubov Akulenko, NGO Center UA head. I give the right to moderate to Sergei Sidorenko. So a couple of words about how we were making this association kit. We got this idea in spring when unilateral trade preferences were introduced to Ukraine, and we realized if Ukraine has the situation as it is, then we will enter the free trade zone, free trade area, not ready. For that, we need some reforms. There is now this Brussels agreement that temporary implementation of the FTA is delayed, and it may give us the impression that we can wait with the reforms. Why that is wrong? We see that there are threats coming from Russia that they may refuse from agreements, and European Union warned that if Russia refuses, then this agreement on delaying FTA will also be cancelled. So we can be faced with the situation that FTA becomes effective in a couple of months, but we will not be able to operate because we delayed the reforms. But the reforms are so important, they have to be implemented in all the sectors. And now I would like to invite our experts who will explain what Ukraine has done, what should be done urgently, and who's responsible for that work. First, Taras Kachka will tell us about food. What will we be happening with food? Yes, you see, I love eating. Basically, I can speak on methodology and on specific cases. The idea of this information resource is that the hundreds of pages of very technical text are very complicated. There are some articles of agreement, some addendums, some tables, some annexes, but we are trying to turn it into quite a comprised and clear document that would explain the contacts with the legal document and the specific facts related to trade and the reforms which are to be implemented in Ukraine. So looking at this infographic on the safe food, you know that in the agreement there is a section on sanitary, phytosanitary norms, and that's on the safety of food products. And this slide, by this slide, we were trying to show the the problems that we have in Ukrainian legislation, what does not correspond to the requirements of European Union that prohibit to export the certain products to the market of European Union. And here, there are basic concepts which are to be included into new legislation. When we are talking about food products, these are mandatory application of HASP principles in companies. There are 7 HASP principles, the cost of them and how it works. When this infographic was being developed, the legislative framework wasn't approved, but thanks to all our joint efforts, the Center UA, American Chamber of Commerce, European Business Association. All of us, we managed to push via the parliament some of the laws, and on Monday the president signed these laws, the law on introducing amendments to the laws on food products, and that implements the whole reform. So the law is to be implemented during 1 year. So as journalists, you can to follow that. Here there are the basic elements of the law. You can follow how the law is being implemented, and during this year there should be many bylaws approved. The competent body is to be reformed, which is being set up on the basis of state sanitary, phytosanitary service. And please monitor the process of creating this body. Next week, the mission of Dmytro from European Commission comes to Ukraine, and they will be assessing some of the dairy product producers in Ukraine, and they will look at whether Ukrainian producers correspond to the requirements of the European Union, whether they will be allowed to the EU market, because now the only category of goods which Ukraine does not supply to European Union, these are agricultural products of animal origin, milk, dairy products, and beef and others. So please say a couple of words for journalists who will be to be blamed if we do not achieve the level when we can export all these food products. Who's responsible now? You see here we have names of the politicians who are to be responsible. We have two ministries, the Ministry of Agrarian Policy and of Healthcare, but the government has passed a decision, and you've heard that resolution of the Cabinet of Ministers number 442 on reorganization of the controlling executive bodies. That's reform according to which the number of controlling bodies was reduced, and the competent body will not be now subordinate to the Ministry of Agricultural Policy, will be subordinate to the Cabinet of Ministers directly, and the Prime Minister will also be responsible here, but at the level of policies and bylaws. The key role is played by the Ministry of Public Health when it comes to setting requirements to the safety of food, and the Ministry of Agricultural Policy, as well as the competent body, because now de facto it's subordinate to the Ministry of Agricultural Policy, but it will be subordinate to the Cabinet of Ministers. So we need to follow their activities. We will be able to ask questions later. Let's first listen to all of them, and I will mention one more thing. Probably you all know, but we need to mention that all the infographic which will be there, and this association kit you can find on the website of European Pravda. So now we would like to invite Dmytro Lutsenko, and he will talk not about food but about non-food. What do we need to do to avoid possible problems in non-food industry? Thank you, esteemed colleagues. I would like to mention this is quite an important topic, and as I understand, it draws a lot of attention from our partners in Russian Federation and the Customs Union. The sphere of regulation of non-food products, which is known as technical regulations, is an important part of association agreement, implementation of association agreement, and Ukrainian products will not be able to enter European market without all these things. Now association agreement removes customs barriers, duty barriers. The duties are cancelled, but Ukrainian products and its access to European market is still difficult because of non-tariff, non-duty technical barriers. And this part of association, there is a part of association agreement which is on technical regulations. What it is about? In order for Ukrainian products to freely have access to European market, for that Ukraine needs to have a system of technical regulations which will be similar to such system in European Union. Then both countries will have the grounds to have trust, and there will be no need in certification of Ukrainian products both in Ukraine and then in European Union by European bodies at a higher price than it can be done in Ukraine. Ukrainian results of the assessment will be recognized by the European Union, and then the products without duties, without technical barriers will have an access to European market. Now we have only duty-free access, but technical barriers are still there. The responsible body for that is the Ministry of Economic Development and Trade of Ukraine, even though among the technical regulators and there are some which fall under other ministries. You know that the minister resigned, but the ministry is still responsible for that. And I know that they are trying to work in this direction. Introducing European system requires changes of not just legislation, but changes of infrastructure and mentality. Don't be afraid of these changes. They are not as scary as it might seem. The Ukrainian products are not as non-competitive as you may think, but in most cases this is the issue of not competitiveness or whether the Ukrainian products satisfy the safety requirements, but the problem is with the marketing and with documenting. And so these two aspects, technical documents which we need to submit to Europe, and marketing, promotion of the products in EU market. So all these aspects we show on one of the sides of this magic cube. We understand that what we need to change in mentality is in the left part of it, and what are the ideological differences between Ukrainian and European system. In Ukraine, we still have this post-Soviet practice and the EU system, which grew up on market foundation, puts responsibility on a producer. The state in the EU does not regulate everything, does not set all the rules like it has been done in Ukraine and like it was done in Soviet Union. But the state is only concerned about the requirements on the safety of products. It's not the quality of products. It's the quality is the issue of competition, and the price, whether the consumer is satisfied. The state shouldn't dictate what the quality should be, what should be the color or whatever. That's decided by the consumer, but the state takes care of safety. And on the right, you can see what has been done already, and several pieces of legislation were passed, very important laws on standardization metrology, which means that the system of metrology is to be done but in accordance with the provisions of association agreement. For that, the draft law on technical regulations is important. It's registered in the parliament in the end of May. Now, as far as I know, thanks to reanimation reform package, they are trying to reanimate its consideration. We need it. Why? Because it creates serious legal obstacles for full-fledged implementation of regulations and directives of EU into Ukrainian legislation. There are certain legal limitations that we cannot pass the texts which would satisfy European laws with the law that is effective now.
Законодавство Європейського Союзу. Його не
If the law is not adopted by the end of this year, this will lead to very serious problems with implementation of the association agreement, because the regulations cannot be passed like it's passed today and becomes effective next day. Even delaying the agreement for a year actually does not address this problem. We need this law to develop the regulations which would correspond to the directives and regulations of the EU. Besides, infrastructurally and technically, we need to work with personnel, with even equipment. The European Union provides financial support, but there are problems with efficiency of using it, and the European Union is ready to do that in the future, but there should be common efforts put.
Dmytro, will you please explain very briefly what should we do immediately, either to pass necessary legislation or to assist producers in adaptation to the Euro standards, how you call them? You believe this is actually the two-sided problem. We have to do both things. We have to adapt our legislation, and we have to support and encourage producers to work in new way.
Митним союзом
Those who already had some relations with the EU, for them adaptation will be easier. For those who oriented to Russia, for them the way will be longer. But the association agreement contains also such a rule about adaptation, which says that any standard should have at least 6 months of delay, which would delay in coming in force, allowing manufacturers and producers to get ready for compliance with this technical standard. Thank you, Dmytro, for your explanation. Now I'd like to invite Mr. Zeldi, who will speak on the customs problems, because as we know, the customs service is also an obstacle today for trade. Answering Sergei's question, I should state that the customs office is actually the last mile for in a route of any goods and commodities. Unfortunately, during last years, the customs has been being criticized very extensively, and quite often the European Customs Service is set as an example for good customs service functioning. So what is the European way of work for the customs? Actually, the association agreement provides for rather limited number of customs documents which should be shown at the checkpoint. The association agreement provides that up to 70% of the customs code of the EU should be incorporated to Ukrainian legislation. We have passed our customs code quite recently, but frankly speaking, it does not differ much from the European customs code, but the major problem lies in the implementation. It is very important that the spirit of the intentions of the European customs code should be incorporated to the Ukrainian one. We should reflect at least 6 major pillars of the customs activities, and then measure the successes and the progress in the customs service work in line with that 6 pillars and what will be done in those 6 major spheres in customs service. That 6 spheres which I mentioned, they are important not only for the association agreement implementation, but they are actually important for the country growth. Just look at at item number 3, customs declaration. Sure, we have this requirement about customs declaration, and now this could be done by fax. In Europe, there is a general principle that any applicant who submits the customs declaration, he or she is fully responsible for this declaration, and further on he will be responsible for the for what it will entail, and actually nothing more is required. While in Ukraine, you should provide customs declaration, and then all backup documents, that is all supporting documents which are grounds for information provided in your customs declaration, and later on, within 3 years, you may get the customs audit, which will again check up whether your filling in the declaration was correct or not. The role of the customs declaration is extremely important, and it contributes to the Ukrainian rating in doing business index. As of today, Ukraine remains in 146th position in that rating without any improvements, and simplification of the customs procedure might contribute greatly to the improvement of this position. Another important thing which should be done in favor of the exporters, which will simplify for Ukrainian producers export to the EU. This is a broad public awareness campaign about what goods and commodities are subject to the European preferences, and which are subject to special preference certificates. Also, there should be simplification procedures provided for big exporting companies, which should be authorized to provide approval of certificate of the origin for all the goods. This position is extremely important during all this term of the regime of special unilateral preferences, and also later on. In the EU, they got accustomed to issuance of such origin certificates, and while in Ukraine for customs service, this is a novelty, and now there is an issue whether they will be able to switch to the issuance of such certificates within one night when the association agreement will come in force. It might be obvious that when shifting to these origin certificates, many companies, exporting companies, will require consultations from the customs service about necessary documentation for getting such certificates, etc. Although I mentioned about necessary legislative amendments, but the changes actually are more needed not in terms of the letter of the law, of the text of the law, but in terms of the spirit of the law. The speed of the association agreement implementation will very much depend on the position of the Ministry of Finance. That is, Euro 1 certificate should be issued by the Ministry of Finance. Then the State Fiscal Service in person of Igor Belous and Mr. Makarenko, who is deputy head of the head of State Fiscal Service, and he is responsible for Customs Service. Thank you, Robert. Our time limit is now closed, and now I would like to invite Liubov Akulenko, who will describe about tax issues. What should be changed? Good afternoon, esteemed friends. I heard quite often from our government officials that our companies won't be competitive in the EU, but I never heard about them, what they are doing. And in terms of competitiveness, it is important to compare fines which should be paid by a company who violates the anti-monopoly legislation. And our anti-monopoly committee has different fines for different levels of violations, while this is impossible in the EU. In the EU, it is quite standard procedure. They look at the amounts of your production, then multiply it by the period during which you violated anti-monopoly legislation,
З сусідніми компаніями поділили
and also take into account the cartel agreement, and then add this coefficient to the total amount of fine. The general amount of fine cannot exceed 10% of the annual turnover of the company. This latest requirement actually coincides with the Ukrainian rule, but the way to reaching this limit is quite different. In order for our companies to work under competitive conditions, the law on the anti-competitive measures should be amended. Why we have written about July 2014, because we believed that free FTA would start in November 2015. Looking at our kit, you will see 5 different fields for improvement, while any changes are made only in three out of that five. Because these were spheres where we lobbied necessary legislation. And while we are standing here today, we need your support and advocate for necessity to do practical steps for implementation of the association. I would encourage you to look at our kit association, at our implementation kit, and continue ask provocative questions to the government representatives. Now Q&A session. My question is to Dmytro. The draft law on technical regulations. What is the situation with this law? Whether it is drafted, whether it is in the parliament, how much ready it is for the passage, etc. The draft law is registered in the parliament under number 4924. It was introduced by a group of members of parliament, Ms. Lapina, Ms. Kuzhel, and some other members of parliament. And actually, this draft law has passed already the technical expert groups, and as far as I heard, this week it has passed the parliamentary committee on the issue. As far as I know, there are some nuances in the text which should be corrected, and we have some recommendations before the second reading. Actually, if there is political will and a willingness of the parliament, it could be easily passed by this parliament. If it won't be passed, if it is not passed by this parliament, that it will be inherited by the next convocation, and it is very important that it is passed by the end of the year. We believe that this convocation of the parliament would be able to pass it in first and second reading almost entirely, but we are not sure. My question is probably to Serhiy Sidorenko, whether there is any demand for your information product. It seems to me that it is worthy, and nevertheless, those whose role is to implement the reforms. For example, Dmytro Lutsenko from the presidential administration, whether you provided such a presentation of this association kit for him. Speaking about demand and about number of reviews, it is considerable. There are tens of thousands of people, and we have a lot of reposts and links shared by people. We cannot be sure that these are members of presidential administration who are users of it. The idea was to popularize in society what is needed, and in order to create public pressure upon the government. In the government, both Mr. Simkiv, Mr. Yatsenyuk, and a lot of people know quite well what should be done, but they can nevertheless do nothing, while broad public should be aware what should be done and make pressure. Without such pressure, there won't be any positive result and positive movement. So this is actually the product for broad public, for broad, for journalist community. I have a question for Mr. Taras Kachka. How many pages does the association agreement comprise? More than 1,000, but a bigger part of it is the table with tariffs. I know the weight. The weight of it is 60 kilograms. Ukrainian version weighs 60 kilograms. Probably an ordinary person cannot read it. There is a rather complicated structure, an article with reference to the appendix. Appendix makes reference to the table. Table makes reference to something else. So it is a rather difficult thing even for experts. I have a question to you as to one of the authors of the text. I understand that everything related to the FTA is postponed for almost 18 months. Whether it is a hinder for the reform implementation. Today, probably you heard that Russian Federation government has postponed the resolution on tariffs. And I would like to say that there are two different things: postponement of the FTA and the immediate program for changes in Ukrainian legislation about safety of foodstuff, etc. For Ukraine, it is important to preserve a free trade regime with the EU and with Russia, but Ukraine actually does nothing to ruin and future legislation won't damage the trade with the Russian Federation. Actually, I do not see any obstacles in this aspect. All the rest are simply international diplomacy, and that's it. Of course, the key thing are internal domestic reforms, and the agreement sets only legal frame for the reform, but even without it, we can do it. Thank you for the authors of this product. We have sufficient number of copies, and